Hey everyone, it's me, HawkeyeG, and today we're doing another campaign army composition guide. With these guides, I like to go through potential army compositions at various stages of the game, including talk about what buildings would be possible at that time, and then using those compositions in demonstrations to show what they are used for and how they work. This guide will be more generalized for use with any Lizardmen faction. More specific discussions take place in each faction's campaign starter guide. Now, if you are enjoying the videos, please of course remember to like and subscribe. I know I say it all the time, but it really does help the channel grow and shows that you are in fact enjoying the content. I'm happy to keep making it, and I like to see it grow and reach more people. And of course, I'm happy to receive feedback or answer questions in the comments section below as well. Now, if you've watched an army composition guide from me, you can skip ahead to the next section and just watch or listen to the overviews. However, if you've not seen one before, I'll explain how they work in this next section. So in order to do these guides and demonstrations, I simply use the custom battle option, okay? I do play the game on very hard campaign and normal battle difficulty, so some of these compositions are less effective on higher battle difficulty. I basically intend to show the theoretical functional combinations of units and then put them into battle to show how they work, and I want to give people a variety of options for how to play the game or react to or take advantage of different campaign situations. I will try to touch on what does or doesn't work on very hard, and I'll talk about what I see people typically using for that as well, but it's not going to be the focus here. So first, how the rules work, let's go to the campaign map. Like I said earlier, I want to make sure this guide works for any faction and not just those with the 9-slot capitals or with specific units, right? So I'm just going to take a look at a province like this and keep coming back to this as an example and talk about our options considered from there. Okay, so I break this guide up into 4 separate sections. The first section is the first turn, right? When you start the game, what is it that you're likely to have available to you in terms of buildings, and what kind of units or compositions can we make from that, right? So you're going to have one of your basic military buildings and then also your tier 0 units from the settlement. The next part would be the early game. So within about 50 turns, I would essentially expect that each of these settlements is at tier 3. So that means we'd have access to all tier 3 units. And I would typically, I'm going to say essentially 2 military buildings, right? So you can fit one in your main province, one in your second province, and we're going to look at those options, right? If you had 2 tier 3 settlements, what options would you have that would make good compositions? The next part would be the mid game. So that is going to be tier 4 up until around turn 100, right? You get your main settlement to tier 4 and you would add in a 3rd military building. So we'd be able to pick basically any combination of tier 4 units as long as it's like 3 buildings, and you'll kind of see examples of that later. And then of course the late game is your capital's tier 5. You've eliminated all your growth buildings. You have free reign over everything, right? I'm not going to talk about it specifically in terms of, like, I'm assuming in the late game you are going to have more than one tier 5 settlement, and you're going to have access to basically any number of units, any combination of buildings, right? So those are the 4 sections of the game. That's how I'm going to break this guide up. Now, let's go back to the custom battle form. So the reason I use this custom battle form is because I can essentially create a situation where I can say all other factors equal, right? Cost and strength of the army. Here's why you should use this army and what advantages it gives you in this combat situation, right? So I set up an army for myself that I like to give an example with at whatever stage of the game we're talking about. And then I set up an enemy army, which is equal to that. And then once I've got my army set up the way I like it, I set the fund limits to be right around that point so that I can set up some additional armies for the enemy that are going to cost the same. It's going to give us a relatively similar balance of power, and we're going to see how the battle plays out. You know, like I said, trying to make it all things considered, right? The idea here is also to provide an example army at a proper unit ratio, right? So I'm not always going to use a full 20 stack in this custom battle, because sometimes I just won't be able to afford it going up against the same kind of enemy with a different type of army at the same stage in the campaign. So for example, a full stack of Saurus warriors would obviously outperform a full stack of Skink Cohort, but they would cost almost twice as much. So showing a full stack of anything irrelevant of the cost just isn't useful here. I mean, you can see for Skaven, with the Skaven slaves I put in here, we've had a bunch of spillover into a second army anyway, just so that the price balances out. This means that the process will be to first show the composition itself in the custom battle form, as well as talk about what we're using and why. Then we'll show the buildings that we'd have available to us in order to make the composition at that stage of the campaign. And then we might compare this to the enemy army, talk about what strengths or weaknesses we have, specific reasons why you would choose these units and what they're supposed to match up against. And after that, I'll jump into an actual battle replay of this army versus the enemy armies that I've set up and kind of talk about the tactics we use, and you can actually see for yourself what the purpose of these armies is. With that explanation out of the way, let's jump into our first section of the guide. So as you can already see, to begin with, we're looking at our first turn options, right? What units do we have, if any, available to us from the start of the campaign, right? So tier 0 units recruitable from the settlement, and either tier 1 or tier 2 units, depending on which faction you're starting as and which military building they've started with in their capital. That means that we're basically looking at Skinks and Saurus here. I'm going to ignore Tic-Tac-Toe and the Terradons because that's kind of a niche case. By the time you play that campaign, hopefully you'll have that figured out more for yourself. But so, of course, I mean, you've seen it on screen for quite a while now. The first option we're going to look at is Skink Cohort Spam. If you've watched other streamers play, you'll probably recognize this one. In many cases, like I said, to touch on the very hard battle difficulty, people will just spam these armies out until they hit tier 4 and then just go straight to a Stegadon Spam, right? The reality is that even though this is a tier 0 unit, it still has the cost of something like Swordsman for the Empire, right? This Skink Cohort unit, this is more expensive than anything the Skaven are going to have for upkeep, and this is also true in campaign, right? If we look at an Empire stack, again, you can see that these Skink Cohorts with Javelins are going to cost more than any of these basic units that the Empire is going to get at the start of the game. The Crossbowmen are technically going to be more expensive. That's getting slightly out of range of what we're talking about, but their performance is better, right? The thing to keep in mind with the Skink Cohort with Javelins is that they are actually just an upgraded version of the Skink Cohort, right? They still have the shield. They're essentially a sword and shield unit, but with an extra missile attack. So just real quick, I probably don't have to explain this. I know I already touched on it, but just to be clear, right, for this Skink Cohort Spam, it's literally right here. It's a thing you can build in any tier 1 settlement, right? Literally any place that you have that the settlement isn't like damaged or ruins, right, or unconstructed, you can make these. So of course, being a basic unit, being spammed out, there's really not too much to talk about here, right? We picked this unit because it's cost effective and affordable. We are going up against the Skaven because that's quite common for the Lizardmen to have to fight them. And I've got a lot of Skaven slaves packed in here. We could have gone with clan rats, but I kind of wanted to show you that even if you're at a severe numbers disadvantage against the Skaven, and even if you're using this Skink Cohort unit, you can still have a victory. So let's get in and take a look. So, as you can see, I've got a pretty basic formation here. We just spread the Skink Cohort out as wide as we can. Now, one of the key things is you want to have your missiles try to target down some of their more important units, right? Getting hits on the Skaven slaves isn't going to help as much as getting hits on these clan rats, especially because they're probably not going to have shields in the first few turns of the game with what the AI has available. Another important thing is to try and keep yourself somewhat grouped up. Once units start running off all over the place, you want to try to regroup and collect yourself, right? Normally the Skink Cohort is a unit that I use to chase down enemy units, especially as we move into the early game and mid game sections. You keep a handful of these because they're cost effective and one of them can easily run down a group of enemies. But in this case you don't really want to do that, and to be honest I get pretty disorganized in this replay, and I end up taking some damage because of it. It's closer than you really want it to be at the outcome. But you can see there's not a ton of strategy you can have in the early game. And again, we don't have a lot of different units. We don't have specialty units, and we don't have the numbers advantage. So we really just try to get some missile volleys in and just start getting into combat. So you can see some of our units start to flee, take too much damage, fighting some of the better units. But other ones are able to start grouping up and teaming up on some of the enemy forces, and this is really important when you're facing something like the Skaven, right? You can also see that if you're using a Skink Lord, they are not going to perform very well, even against the Spellcaster Lord from the Skaven. So you have to be pretty careful with that in the early game, right? You kind of want to engage their Lord with some of your cheap infantry units instead. And so you can see we're winning some fights, we're losing some fights, and we're definitely starting to get spread out, which we want to try to avoid. So despite being pretty spread out, we are starting to push some of their units off the battlefield, right? It looks like we're still at a disadvantage here, but we are winning in the numbers game. And again, you can see we're winning in a lot of important places where we can still push units off. We're spread out enough in areas that are relatively safe. Again, not great organization. You don't want to spread out like this. you want to be able to group up, because you can see this cluster over here is going to have a great time pushing those away. Now, the balance of power still looks pretty even, but our forces greatly outnumber them at this stage, and really it's just their lord that's over here that still has a decent amount of health in melee combat. But this is where grouping up really counts. I'm not going to run out the rest of this replay, but essentially we just get all these units grouped up in a formation, and even though the balance of power isn't totally broken yet, as soon as their lord gets within proximity of all the units grouped up, he just immediately routs and the battle is over. So you can see we took a decent bit of damage, especially damage on the Lord. You got to be careful with that in the early game, especially with some of the Skink Lords, right? But they're not too hard to manage here. And again, we took some damage on these Skinks, but they're easily replaceable, and it was a poorly managed battle. If you keep your units better grouped up than I did, you'll be able to just kind of sweep clusters of the Skaven off the map and away from you, and they're just going to take a little bit of damage every time until they eventually shatter. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the same army, but I'm going to load up quick against the Empire just to kind of make this demonstration case for the Skink Cohort in the early game, right? Technically, they don't have better stats than a swordsman unit, right? They just don't. But because they have that missile attack, right? And they're more expensive than the rest of these units, the unshielded spearmen and the archers, right? The Empire Tier's hero units are cheaper than Skink Cohort with javelins, and really I view the Skink Cohort as like just a trash super easily replaceable unit, right? Like basically equivalent to these spearmen, but they'll destroy those, right? Now with the Empire in the early game, or really any kind of faction with like spears and archers, even with swords, a more like balanced faction or ranged heavy faction, they're going to really cluster up like this. It gives you a really good opportunity to surround them, make the most out of this. If you can disrupt the backline of this, right, yeah, you'll see we get around enough of these units. You can already see they get so clustered up that we might as well send a couple of them around to flank instead of sending them directly in, being able to get missile shots in the back of moving swordsmen if we can, or else just to get onto melee fights with the archers. And so there's not a whole lot to show with this fight. It almost feels a little lazy for me for watching some of the micro that I did. But again, you just don't have to worry that much about it. It's definitely a little cheaper army. This balanced army that I set up for the Empire, a little bit less expensive than the army that I'm bringing to the table. So we should expect it to perform well. But again, this is it's an army where we give ourselves this slight advantage in melee by hitting them with the javelins. We can shoot them while they're running away as well. And these are already melee units that are going to hold up just fine against these spearmen and most of what you face, but are going to completely and totally disrupt their backline. So you can see in a fight like this, where we're kind of on even terms with somebody, especially, a faction that's not going to be as infantry focused or a little bit more defensive, we actually have a better performance than we did against the Skaven. So that's our first composition. Now, I want to quickly flip over and just kind of show a composition. I've tried to build for, like, if you're one of the Skink Lords, right? If you want to go the Skink route in the early game. All right, so just real quick here, just to jump in. I feel like I probably don't have to explain this, but again, I said I would for these. So if we're going the Skinks route, right, you're going to start with either the Tier 1 as Tehennowin or Tier 2 as Oxyatl. So I kind of speak from the perspective of Tehennowin. Oxyatl's a little bit more of a niche case. Tehennowin's where you might actually be trying to get inventive and creative with combining different armies of Skinks. So you would start with this level 1 building, right? So that's what we'd be looking for on turn 1. And the problem is, at Tier 1, you don't really have, I like Skink Skirmishers. This unit does cost the same as a Skink Cohort in campaign, and frankly, they do serve a purpose. Having they're pretty nice flanking units. It's fire while moving. It's a missile unit with poison damage. They can be really useful, and if you are going to commit to Skinks, you probably want to bring a couple of these and be able to flank while your Skink Cohort are holding down some mobs, right? It's a lot easier to flank with a unit that can fire in any direction while moving. On the other hand, you have these red-crested Skinks, and I wanted to use them here and just to prove a point, and we're not even going to look at the replay for this one, right? The only building you need to make this stuff is a Tier 1 barracks for the Lizardmen, and the red-crested Skink is more expensive, but it's the worst unit, the most useless unit in the roster. It has armor piercing. What do you need armor piercing for in Tier 1? Its melee stats are atrocious, and it's more expensive. There's no reason to take red-crested Skinks. There's almost no reason to take Skink Skirmishers, and frankly, if we were to watch the replay of this battle against the same army we just saw, it's going to perform worse. We're going to take more damage from an army like this than just pure Skink Cohort. So I kind of wanted to make that point. I know that, you know, if we're going to start as somebody like Oxyotl, I believe it is one who gets the tier 2 barracks right away. And so they can make Chameleon Stalkers and Chameleon Skinks. I think Chameleon Skinks are a great unit, and you can use those for the point is that Skink Cohorts with Javelins really are your best Skink unit from for the turn 1 phase, right? Until we're getting to the point where we can diversify, and even then, you know, I would say Chameleon Skinks is really the only other good skink, and I hate saying that. I love the Chameleon Stalker, but the only other thing that you're going to want in early game and on turn 1, just Skink Cohort spam and maybe a handful of Chameleon Skinks, right? A few that you can have some fun with in micro, while everything else just is a wall. But that's all I want to touch on for the Skinks right now. We got one more turn 1 composition to show, and that is going to have some Saurus in it. Now, when we're talking about the races that start with the Saurus building in them, on turn 1, we're basically just looking at this, right? As much as we'd like Saurus with shields, we're just talking about the unshielded variants because a bunch of the factions start with this building to begin their campaigns. However, these units are going to be really useful from the start of the game, right? A couple of Lizardmen faction are going to start with this option, and unless you're playing somebody like Tahenowin, who's specifically restricted, like penalized in upkeep for getting Saurus, you want to use these units. Your Saurus are going to be some of your good units. They're like a staple of the Lizardmen, having like a really solid early game infantry that you can just push with. Actually, three factions are going to start with this as the base. And maybe Nakai, but I honestly don't play Nakai. So, anyways, this is what I was talking about with the ratio earlier. You can see it's still about 50-50 between Saurus Warriors and Skink Cohort with Javelin, because those Skink Cohorts are just so much cheaper, and I still can't build a full 20 stack, even going half and half. But we're going to send this army up against the same number of Skaven, and we're going to see how it goes. So again here, we're horribly outnumbered, right? Even more so than last time that we saw a fight like this. And the enemy should be able to take advantage of flanking, but they really won't be able to do it as well. Again, an important part to note about these Saurus units is that they just have a lot of armor. So even without the shields, these Skaven Slave Slingers are going to have a really hard time doing significant damage to them. That's even true for a lot of the units that we're going to engage directly in melee combat, right? They're just great at shredding through infantry, but the problem is Saurus units are slow, and so you don't want to chase units down unless it's a really high value target. You shouldn't have your Saurus Spears or Saurus Warriors chasing after anything in this campaign. You also really want to make sure that you stay grouped up, right? You don't want to spread too much out with this kind of composition because of how slow they are, and if you really do get teamed up on badly and you're isolated, then you might have some trouble. Now you can see from my actual formation, I've shifted some of my units kind of off to one side, right? Again, I consider the Skink Cohorts to kind of be your trash units that are just there to absorb all the damage, while your Saurus are actually dealing the damage. So what I did here, you know, I set up myself more heavily on this one flank so that ideally we can win some of these fights on the fringe and then just sweep across to the right. We can give position, like we can give up ground and fall back over here on the right, or even just be willing to lose these fights and these units, because we should have significant and quick wins on this side flank and be able to just rapidly push through the enemy army. And again, right, not getting too spread out, not getting too far away from our core, but being able to team up with the strong units that we already have and be able to just kind of push the enemy out very quickly and very rapidly. But you can see even on this right flank, we've broken through in a lot of places just because of how crappy Skaven Slaves are compared to Skink Cohort, right? And with the help of some Saurus Warriors, we can just easily team up on things. When you get to certain points with reduced numbers, you can also set up your Skink Cohort with Javelin for just a really nice missile flank. That's going to do a lot of damage and rout them. The same thing applies to their Lord. Even if you have a Saurus Lord, which I didn't bring here, but I should have, they're not going to have a great time. I don't know, it's going to be a closer fight against the Skaven Warlord, but really you do often end up wanting to tank these Lords with just one or two of your cohort units when you get the chance. And, you know, at a certain point in the battle, once you're grouped up well enough, you can definitely bring your warriors to bear against those lords as well. And now you can kind of see here a little bit, I mean, we've got everything clustered up right here in the middle, right? We're moving as like a solid mass, and it's going to be really hard for any of these units to overtake us. It's hard not to instinctively respond to the threat of some of these missile units, but they just aren't going to do that much damage. You have shields on your cohorts, and you have armor on your Saurus. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's still nice if you can disrupt them every once in a while, but really keeping like your core of Saurus somewhere near the middle and being able to countercharge, and yeah, we're already going to win this fight. They're not even going to be able to make it back in. So you can see this. We don't need the numbers advantage as Lizardmen, and in fact, while playing them, you should fully expect not to have the numbers advantage. So yeah, again, despite being at a significant numbers disadvantage, we actually took less damage with this army than we did with all the other ones, despite very similar costs and the heavily reduced size here. With that replay out of the way, we have now shown all of the different compositions that I would say are reasonable or recommendable at tier 1. Obviously, it's not a long list, but you wouldn't expect that anyway. You don't have a ton of variety of options as any faction in the early game, and you know, for whatever reason, the Skink Cohort with Javelins is just a good unit. Again, if you've seen people play on higher difficulties, you know that they just spam that until they get to the units that they want to use. Some exceptions on campaigns with specific bonuses to the Saurus. But anyway, let's move on to the next part. Okay, so we're back to the campaign map again real quick. We're now moving into the early game overview, where we're going to talk about the kind of units that I would want you to recruit and recommend building compositions out of up until around turn 50, or basically once you have all of your settlements in your starting province at tier 3, even if it's just 2 of them, what kind of buildings we can combine together to get different combinations of units, looking at all the units that are around tier 3, right? So we're going to be considering the Skinks building and the Saurus building, where again, I'm kind of going to be making compositions by pairing off of whatever you started with, right? So we'll be looking at Saurus and Terradons. We'll be looking at Saurus and Cold Ones. We'll have a couple of other honorable mentions, such as Saurus and Kroxigor, as well as Saurus and Beasts. We're then going to look at Skinks paired with Beasts. We're going to look at Skinks paired with Hunting Packs. And then we're just going to have a brief refresher on Skinks paired with Terradons, right? So you can see each of these is just going to be 2 buildings. That means you could have growth and income in both of these settlements and still get 1 military building in each. That's kind of how I would recommend setting it up. And so this is going to allow us to get a bunch of different compositions that are going to work well in different situations. And I'm going to make some strong recommendations, of course, for each set and each setting. But let's go back to the custom battle and take a look at some of the compositions and replays. So before we get any further in this discussion, I did want to touch on one thing real quick. That's just this composition that you see before you, right? We've got a Life Slan here, then Heaven's Mage, Skink Chief, a couple of Saurus Scar veterans, and a bunch of Stegadons. Now, the reason I put this on the screen is just to, like I said, brush up against what I would consider the meta, or at least what I see as most common for a lot of legendary difficulty streamers, right? Again, just to remind you, you move in the early game, you just spam Skink Cohort with Javelins, and then you shift into Stegadons at tier 4. Obviously, this is not an early game unit. It doesn't fall under my classification of early game units. Those people would still be using the Skink Cohort spam. So just keep that in mind. That's still going to be a relevant unit, and that this is what you're going to be looking at going forward. If this is all you came here for, was to find out which 2 compositions should I be using if I'm just like looking for something simple and spammy, those are the 2 compositions. I'm not going to return to the Stegadon Doomstack until a little bit later, but I just wanted to bring it up here to get that out of the way. Alright, so like I said, for this early game, we're still kind of splitting compositions into pairing something with Skinks or pairing something with Saurus. Of course, even so, this is a Saurus composition. We still have some Skink Cohort with Javelins. Like I said, great for filling the gaps. Cheap little unit that you can throw in there when you have room to recruit. But yeah, so I'm going to be pairing up things with those 2 base units, right? It should encompass the majority of situations you'd encounter across any faction, with Tic-Tac-Toe pretty much being the only exception, right? So the first composition we're looking at here is Saurus and Terradons, right? You keep the Saurus building, you take the Terradons building, and for myself personally, in my play experience, this is what I'd consider like the next step in Lizardmen, right? You start the game and you take the Skink Cohort stack, and then the next step is to incorporate Terradon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas into your composition, whether that's with Skinks or Saurus. These are just too good of a unit to not include. basically this composition just combines dominant melee infantry with powerful ranged flying monstrous units. It really is meant to be an army that can win about just about anything, right? It's going to do well. It's like a generalized composition. So let's take a look at some of the replays and see how it performs. So real quick, before we jump into that replay, I did want to quick show, I've got an Empire army here. This is the kind of stuff they're going to have available at tier 3. I tried to follow the same rules of accessibility. I know that the AI won't follow them, but again, just for the sake of equality and demonstration. So for something like this, I might just pull out one of my other units to equalize the cost. But this is the kind of Empire stack that we're looking at, a balance of spearmen and swordsmen with archers, handgunners, and mortars, right? And then for the Skaven, I'm able to manage a little bit more of an expensive stack. This one doesn't actually follow the rules, but this is what I typically see them with. And having played a few Lizardmen campaigns recently, I just tried to think of what would be like a good composition that I fight that annoys me all the time. So, of course, we got warp fire throwers. The danger there is they're going to do a lot of damage to your armored units, right? And of course, rattling gunners, just generalist, going to be good against the flying units. We've got some decent infantry that are going to at least hold out a little bit against your Saurus warriors and so on. And then, of course, fire while moving ranged units. So they kind of got it all. So we're going to watch a couple of these fights, and those are the example enemy armies that I'm going to be testing these compositions against. So we start out in a pretty basic formation. I like to use the Skink Cohort up front. Like I said, I basically just use them as missile-absorbing trash. We've got the Terradon Riders, which I try to keep a little bit behind the lines just because I don't want them to be targeted. Let's speed things up here and take a look at how it progresses. Now, keep in mind, I can't actually see these gutter runners yet. I mean, I know they're there because I put them in the composition ahead of time. Like I said, here you can see the enemy, especially these rattling guns, are already starting to shoot at some of our Skink Cohorts instead of shooting at the Terradons. This is important. And then I get kind of a pretty great, let's just watch. Terradons have that boulder drop ability, in case you didn't know. Let's just watch what happens here. So, that's one of the reasons you use this composition, right? They have just a very powerful ability, that single-use boulder drop ability. Normally, you don't get battles that are set up quite this nice and neat for you. I don't really know how this one came together. Same thing happens with the Empire, honestly, so maybe the campaign battles are a little bit crazier than that, but so you can see we kind of get out there, we get a big hit, and we do some early damage to give us the advantage. That's how this composition is supposed to work, right? You get a lot of damage in with your Terradon Riders early on, and that allows your infantry to overcome their front line a little bit more easily. You can then pressure back some of their ranged units. You don't necessarily want to be chasing gutter runners if you can help it. But that is kind of why I bring the regular Terradon Riders. They've got the poison missiles, so they still have that, debuff. But then these are kind of used more for rushing, right? This isn't as valuable of a unit to me, just because it's not like the Fire Leech Bolas are what I want for dealing damage to the infantry, right? So you end up just pushing things. This is the kind of situation where we're going to use Skink Cohort to be chasing down enemy units as well. And yeah, so like I said, you can see the problem up against this composition really is these gutter runners. And so if you want to try to chase them away a little bit. You still don't really have anything with this composition that can effectively run them down and destroy them. Yeah, look at that. These Terradon Riders with Fire Leech Balls will do some damage to them, but they're also going to take a lot of damage in the process, and you just don't have anything else that can really catch them. So be careful about chasing them down, right? So, yeah, the idea is this works better against enemies who don't have firewall moving units, but you can see the results here, right? We're already well in the lead, and there's not too much more to say, just straggler units that we go hunting down. So let's kind of skip to the end and see how the results look like. Yeah, so it doesn't take much longer to get there. Take a little damage on our Lord and one of the Saurus units, and a Skink Cohort as well. So you can see I'm willing to kind of put these Terradon Riders more at risk in some of these fights, but just the losses, the comparative losses and the outcome of this battle really do show the results of this composition. It's very strong, and Terradon Fire Leech Bolas are a unit that just shouldn't be a tier 2 unit, but I'm not going to complain in this situation. We're going to then run the same composition up against this Empire army here and see how it performs. Really should have pulled one of these Saurus units to equalize the cost of these armies, but it's pretty much going to be the same results. In fact, with the Lizardmen, I'd say a composition like this, right, the infantry, the melee infantry, and the flying missile units, this is honestly going to work better against these kinds of opponents, right? You're going to be able to, again, just the damage that you can inflict on their front lines and forcing them into the retreat. You have to be careful about their missile units, of course, but if you just approach them correctly with your whole army, you'll be able to push their missile units back pretty easily and break their front lines easily. And once their front lines crumble, their artillery is free game. Now, let's move forward a little bit. So you can see those mortars getting pretty good damage on the Saurus Spears on their way in, some good target fire. Skink Cohorts taking a bunch of damage from these handgunners. But again, like, this is exactly what I want, right? I don't care how much damage these Skink Cohort take. They're really not in this composition particularly because I need their strength, or they have their purpose is literally just to take the damage. Now, here again, we see the same thing. The AI lines all their ranged units out up front and then pulls them back as I approach, meaning that these bombs hit both their ranged units and their melee units. Now everything's at half health, and this fight's pretty much over, right? I mean, I know it's not quite, but our front line hits the infantry, hits the front line, smashes them. They're already taking a bunch of damage. Sends some of my Terradon riders out to chase down some of these units, try to get them to rout. The ones that don't rout, try to send the Skink Cohort after as much as you can. Try not to spread your Saurus too much out in the middle, and the battle's already over. So like I said, a strong composition. You know, again, I kind of had the advantage of, you know, one Saurus Spears that I should have pulled to make this a cost comparative fight, but the results speak for themselves, especially the lack of damage on all these units. You shouldn't expect to get that perfect of a boulder drop on all of these fights, but it's just a great composition. So hopefully I've made my point there. I think we've talked about it enough. Next composition is another Saurus one. Here, I've combined Saurus units with some Cold One Spear Riders. Now, a lot of people don't like cavalry. I'm already like preempting this with an explanation of why you would use these even before anybody criticizes it. So that just goes to show how at least my perception of other people's perception of cavalry is. But you can see, like, this is like a utility unit, right? I do think that Saurus combined with Cold One Spear Riders can serve a purpose, and basically it's if you're struggling with the Skaven ranged units, right? If you're having a hard time getting the same kind of value out of your Terradon riders that I did in that fight, or you're struggling to beat armies that have gutter runners, warp fire throwers, rattling guns, right? When the Skaven are leaning heavily into their missile units, you're having a hard time getting value with the Terradon riders. This is where you want to bring the cavalry. Even when you're bringing cavalry, you still want a lot of infantry because these aren't going to do anything useful for you in a siege. And that's the biggest difference between this and the previous composition. It's why I would recommend Terradons with Fire Leech Bolas over this composition, but I still think this is one that works great. And if we're talking Kroxigor specifically, he gets 50% upkeep reduction for both Saurus and Cold Ones, so it is kind of the perfect excuse to use it. But really, any Saurus using Lord that's going to go up against a decent amount of Skaven, you can find value in this. Let's get into the fight and see how it plays out. So here we are with the setup. Again, you know, I'm not using terribly complicated formations here. We just put the Cold One Spear Riders on the outside of the formation so that they can eventually come around the flanks and hit them in the back. Let's move forward a little bit and see what it looks like once the action starts. So you can see before I even really get into battle, I'm starting to move the Cold Ones out into positions, especially because the enemy isn't reacting to it at all. Gives me a little bit of time to prepare. Just kind of walk them out to the sides, give myself that positional advantage. And so, of course, again, I don't know the gutter runners are there, but I know that they're there. But we run up, we can get some okay trades with the Skink Cohort. Certainly better than we got against the Empire, that's for sure, right? So it goes to show you the strength of those more defensive playstyles as well. But we're just kind of set up on the flanks. We want to get our infantry line moving up to contest it and push some of these ranged units back. We get our Skink Cohort just firing on the gutter runners, and then we start moving the cavalry in to hit from the flanks, kind of start engaging with their front line, and they don't have a reason to really escape as much with their ranged units. But once we get around to the flank, you'll see they kind of panic and start to try to pull some of these units out, but they have nowhere to go. And so we're just able to easily pile on them. That's the thing about flying units approaching from the front, right? Is they're going to see it coming a mile away, and they are going to proactively move their units out of the way. Meanwhile, in this situation, I'm able to kind of bounce from unit to unit a bit. We're able to get a little bit of a surround on them, or at least prevent them from fully retreating. And I think that's one of the challenges you face when you're trying to use flying units in these sorts of situations, right? I still think the Terradon Fire Leech Bolas is my recommended composition here. But the advantage you have with this composition is it's much easier to like keep their backline disrupted. Trying to chase down their backline with your flying units just isn't going to work as well, and these Cold One Spear Riders are just going to have like the speed and ground dominance advantage that you need. I mean, you can see they're really like your Terradon Fire Leech Bulls will do okay against everything, but they're more for fighting infantry than they are for fighting the missile units. When you're going up against the Skaven, your disadvantage might be, or your difficulty might be, fighting their missile units. And so that's where the Cold One Spear Riders really come in. But you can see the battlefield is just a chaotic mess. We've broken a lot of their infantry, but we still have work to do on this. Don't you wish you had a Heaven's Mage with the Comet of Chaos Andorra, but this is the early game, so I wouldn't expect to have it. But you can see I'm even pushing some of my Skink Cohort into the back line and trying to get some flanks with them. Trying to push this one through here. Somehow he gets stuck on their Lord. But this way we can start chasing down some of their slower missile units with the Skink Cohort and chase down these gutter runners with the Cold One Spear Riders and really get them taken care of. So that's pretty much all we have to see for this replay. Let's go take a look at the results. Yeah, so it doesn't take too much longer, and you can see, I mean, that's the thing. Cavalry units are going to dominate in a field battle. Flying units are going to do way better than cavalry units in a siege battle, right? But overall, we really didn't take that much damage on this army. We took a lot of damage on the Cold One Riders, but we didn't necessarily see a lot of deaths and a lot of losses. We did see a little bit more losses here, but also they saw significantly more losses as well. So just some things to keep in mind. Another opportunity or option for people who might not want to do the Terradon Riders route. This is another good route to go, especially if you're struggling with some of the Skaven missile units. Now, I've got a couple more compositions for Saurus that I want to talk about, but I'm not going to show any battles on them. I don't really think it's worth diving into the battles because I don't even know. You know, these are compositions that I'd recommend for fun, but not necessarily for effectiveness. I want to keep the real recommendations and demonstrations to a minimum to focus more on the kinds of like I want to show you what I'm recommending to you, but I want to give some other options as well, right? Just some combinations you may or may not have thought of. So standing here, we have the combination of Saurus and Kroxigor, right? Now, I love the idea of this combination, but it's just not as relevant anymore. It worked much better earlier in this game's lifespan, but it's not useful enough against enough factions anymore. And frankly, there's just better options which outclass this one, right? Like, why would you take Kroxigor when you could take Fire Leech Bolas Terradons? Like, it's just ridiculous, right? The reason you would want to go this route is if you were thinking of going into Temple Guard and Sacred Kroxigor as your mid-game options. Again, potentially outclassed, depends on which faction you're playing as, but the reason, like one of the big reasons you would do this is because they share the same perk slot on the red skill tree for your Lord, right? So whatever Lord is leading your army, Temple Guard and Kroxigor share the same skill point. So Saurus I don't know if I'd even recommend investing in the Saurus skill on your red line because it's pretty bad, but this is the composition you would go with if that was your plan to transition into in the mid-game, was a Temple Guard and Sacred Kroxigor combination. This is probably what you would have at that point in time, just because it's what you would have available while you're working towards that, right? The real problem is, I just don't think there's enough of a purpose to be served by them. Kroxigor stats just aren't good enough, right? They're reliant on that charge bonus, but their stats are pathetic even with the charge bonus. They don't do a lot of damage, and again, we have armor piercing. We do have the anti-infantry, right? But the armor piercing it's probably not valuable enough at this stage of the game, right? I think that maybe if you're hunting something like, if you're fighting somebody like Dark Elves or High Elves, this could be a little bit more useful, but they're still going to take a lot of damage, and it's going to be hard to get a lot of value out of factions because pretty much everybody has access to spearmen, right? It's probably too early to require much armor piercing, and even if you did, I'd think you might want Razordon Hunting Pack or a Stegadon instead. So it also seems like this is the type of army to try to punch up with. You would hold things in place with your spears and then use your Kroxigor to damage them, right? So this would be a good composition for infantry-heavy opponents. But the problem is that means you're going to adopt a more defensive posture in that fight, and the Lizardmen aren't meant to adopt a defensive posture in battle, right? They're not protecting their artillery or sitting back protecting their missiles, but that's kind of how you would play this. I think one other advantage you could get is then you're going to be able to use some more of the missile infantry, right? An army like this, you might want to sprinkle in a little bit of some missiles to be able to kind of get some flanks. You'd at least have the Skinks as an option to bring in here, which can be kind of nice. But yeah, you You just don't need Kroxigor to break through the front lines effectively as the Lizardmen, right? We can do that with our Saurus warriors. We don't need the Kroxigor to be coming through, and their stats and their damage just is not good enough for their entity size, right? They definitely don't do enough damage and don't have enough value for how few units they bring and how relatively easy they are to kill. I mean, they have a high armor value, but they have no shields, right? 15% missile resistance is okay, but again, the kinds of armies you'd be using them against, you might be taking more damage than you're dealing. Yeah, they're just not as relevant. Still worth your consideration, however. The next honorable mention I have for the Lizardmen is Saurus paired with Beasts. Now, I mentioned this already, but I think this, again, it kind of has some of the same pros and cons as the other one, right? The biggest problem with this is it's just too expensive. Your Beast units are going to be really expensive, right? And so trying to form an army with Saurus and Beasts is going to be tough because Saurus are also expensive. It can still be effective, right? Having some of these Stegadons with Solar Engine, this is why I put them in here. They have good range, which is going to force the enemy to come to you. It's like pseudo-artillery, right? Which means that your Saurus warriors aren't going to have to chase stuff down as much. These are going to be able to get some good value. They're maybe not going to be super effective against mobs. I don't know how you feel about that. In my experience, this isn't like an amazing, anti-infantry artillery piece. But it's fairly versatile, and going the Beast route would allow you to bring in some Stegadons, if that's what you'd prefer, if you're trying to fill some of these other slots with that, right? We can have like a smaller army here if we throw in a Stegadon and drop some of our other units. So just some options to consider. But like I said, I think like there's nothing wrong with this composition. It'll be very effective. It's just too expensive. It works well by drawing the enemy in, but the other part of the problem is there's a very good chance the enemy will not come to you because they'll have artillery of their own, right? The Skaven, the Empire, the Vampire Coast, all of those are potentially going to be bringing their own artillery, in which case bringing a composition like this actually puts you at a disadvantage, right? You aren't as likely to face it against the Tomb Kings or the Darker High Elves, but there is still a chance that they bring some kind of artillery, and if they're just sitting back and blasting you, you're just not really getting the advantage that you're looking for. I think ultimately it has a low likelihood of having really high value combined with the overall cost, so it makes this composition not as relevant. However, like I said, it's still effective, still fun to play, still a good and useful combination with some good synergies, so something I want you to consider. Now, moving on to the units that I would pair with Skinks, if that's where your campaign starts. You may shudder at the look of this composition, but don't worry, we're going to get through it, right? Now, a friend of mine may not prefer this option, but after testing each, I do want to recommend this one first, right? The Skinks and Beasts combination, right? Don't mind the Chameleon Stalkers. We'll get to see how poorly they perform in the battle, and I'll change my recommendation for those spots. But the rest of it stays. Basically use the Stegadons to help pin things in place and take tough fights, right? This is gonna be the thing that allows you to beat enemy lords, right? You send the Stegadon after them so that your red-crested skink chief doesn't get crushed, right? You can then have the Skink Cohort, both for firing missiles as well as actually taking melee fights. And then you have the Chameleon Skinks to shoot things which are pinned in place by the Stegadon, by the Skink Cohort, getting some flanks, giving you different advantages, right? The Chameleon Skinks can go on skirmish mode and bait enemies away if that's needed. The cohorts are cheap, and combining this with the Beast will allow you to afford the Pharaoh Stegadons, and then the Stegadons hold thing in place for the Skinks to shoot them, right? It's a nice little circle of life, a little bit of synergy there. So the theory then is to use the Chameleon Stalkers as the shock infantry as they're described, to kind of move them in, move them out. But you'll see they just take way too much damage. I want to include these units because I like the concept of them. But people who say that they're not good are right, and their performance in these battles will show. So let's get into a replay and take a look. So in this battle, I did what I learned how to do as Oxyotl because it was fun and I was having a fun campaign. Since all of these units have stock, you can start hitting with the Chameleon Skinks and then use that to bait the army out so that you can move in with the Chameleon Stalkers. The Chameleon Stalkers don't look like they have that bad of stats. Their melee defense should be good. They have a good charge bonus. They even have more armor than the Skink Cohort, but I think it's just the shield and just their inabilities in prolonged combat. Maybe it's just the low model count. I don't know exactly what it is, but it turns out that they suck. So let's take a look here. We get in close. We can use these Chameleon Skinks early on to start getting some hits in. You don't want to keep them in there too long. But just getting some free damage because you also have stock, and then being able to pull away, especially when you get them to disrupt their formation like this. Like, the ideal situation is the Storm Vermin chases a single Chameleon Skink to the edge of the map and becomes irrelevant, right? That's a good trade for you if something like that happens. So we kind of slowly move up here. They actually break formation, which allows us to start moving everything in, kind of pulling them out. That's one of the things I really like to do with some of the Vanguard deploy of Chameleon Skinks. And yeah, I mean, they're starting to shoot at us. We've got good missile resistance. We've got low model counts, so we can kind of dodge it. And you get things into the fight. And you can see part of the problem with this composition is you're going to have a hard time breaking through to their missile units, right? It's kind of a damage battle. Who can out-damage the others? But yeah, see, like, I mean, I know this is Storm Vermin, but I can't believe how bad these Chameleon Stalkers do in this fight. It's really embarrassing. But like this over here, right? These are clan rats with shields. Well, their shields aren't going to be too much worth when they're getting shot in the back by 3 different sources. You can even get the flanking attack by just sending the Skink Cohort in. Right, so like I said, you can use these Feral Stegadons just for tanking things, for getting in the way of things. They're going to do a lot of damage. They're going to be good fighters against, you know, their lords, like their leader units. And they're just going to provide such an amazing opportunity for the Chameleon Skinks. So this is the kind of battle where focusing on specific targets is a little more important, right? You can see we cause like a cascading route. You don't really expect to win every fight one-on-one. You want to kind of use your Stegadons to create fights that you can win, combining your forces with Skinks by adding them onto the Stegadon fight and being able to kind of, again, like I've talked about before, sweeping off from one side and being able to push across to the other side. It is really nice to have the Chameleon Skinks to deal with something like Gutter Runners as well. But so you can see at this point, we basically just push them all to the outskirts of the map, and it should be a pretty easy win from here. So certainly not a flawless victory. If you would have looked at the health of the units right before the battle ended, they are just not in great shape. It looks worse than it is, though. As you can see, really, the most damage we've taken is on the Skink Cohort with Javelins and the Chameleon Stalkers. But yeah, if anything, making this guide and doing these replays just proved to me that Chameleon Stalkers really are a bad unit. You could say maybe the problem is that I used them, you know, too early in this fight. I used them up ahead and tried to have them too hard in the front and should have used them more as a flanker. And I would agree with that. I so desperately want there to be a use for them, but when you just look at the results from the rest of these units, it seems like there really isn't. So what I would recommend, you take these out. If you can get another Feral Stegadon in there, I mean, the more of these, the merrier, right? You don't want to overload on Chameleon Skinks, but you do want to fill those gaps in, and so we have plenty of money to put in some Skink Cohort, you know, balance it out with the Skaven army, or for that Empire army, we probably would drop a couple of those. But you can see, like, this looks really good, right? This is a great composition, a great balance, a great ratio. And in fact, at this point, I'd probably be adding more Feral Stegadons and Skink Cohorts to max it out and keeping about the same number of Skinks. Maybe 1 or 2 more for some flanks, but you get the idea, right? Skinks and Beasts, if you're playing a Skink-focused character, or you're starting with Skinks, or you just like them, this is the route that I would recommend you go down if you're not going to do the Saurus and Terradon Riders route. So that's that composition. Let's look at the next one. So our next composition, again, not perfect. Again, like I said, this is the series of battle demonstrations that really proved to me that Chameleon Stalkers they're not good. They should be good. Their stat line looks good. How does a unit that has 12 better melee defense take so much more damage? Again, it's partly the way that I'm using them, but anyway, getting a little sidetracked here. This combination of units is Skinks paired with the hunting pack, right? The different kinds, not the standard beasts, but like the Razordon hunting pack, Ancient Salamander, Dread Saurian building tree, right? So the idea here, well, one of the big ideas here, that these are on the same skill tree, right? These are the same perk on the red skill tree, gives bonuses to all different kinds of Skinks and to your hunting packs. So you can get a lot of good synergy out of that, right? It's not necessarily a perfect synergy otherwise, but hunting packs are strong and Skinks are cheap. So again, it's another good combination of something powerful and something cheap and easy to replace, right? Again, I have Chameleon Stalkers here, particularly in this fight, we get to see how bad they are. But so we stick to what we know. We have Skink Cohort for entry missiles and melee combat. We then have the Salamander hunting packs for missile combat. And feel free to throw in some Lizardons too, especially if Skaven are leaving heavily into something like warp fire throwers, or if you're going up against like the Dark Elves as Oxyotl, right? That's where you'd want more Lizardons to deal with their Black Arc Corsairs, the stuff with more armor. I still like to bring Chameleon Skinks here. However, like this is the extra little flank option that helps set your whole sweeping victory in motion, right? Like I talked about trying to kind of win on one side of the battlefield and carry that momentum across the whole thing. But basically, we just get the Skink Cohorts into combat, try to leave some out for getting some shooting on the flanks where possible, and then set your hunting packs in place. The hunting packs have just enough of a firing arc to get their shots mostly over your own units as well. Let's take a look at the replay. So we start this battle, I start to spread my troops out a little bit after the deployment phase because I wanted to at least get the timer running. But you can see we can Vanguard deploy these Chameleon Skinks pretty much wherever we want. So sticking them way out on the flank and keeping them in reserve until we really set things into motion and break their formation can be very useful. On top of that, I've just kind of got things spaced out between the Chameleon Stalkers and the Salamander hunting packs, right? What I want is for the Skink Cohort to kind of get engaged with things and then try to find places where the Chameleon Stalkers to enter combat to assist where necessary, while also setting up the Salamander hunting packs with good firing lines, good firing arcs, and good targets to focus on. So let's move ahead and take a look. Now, since we're using some ranged units here, I tried to set up a little bit better of a surround, especially since they're not moving. And with this army, like I said, you know, Salamander hunting packs, the hunting packs in general, are expensive, but not too expensive. And since the only other thing we're using here is Skinks, we've got a lot of wiggle room. So you can see we can bring a lot of Skaven Cohort. And this is kind of the phase of the game where the Skaven are going to be starting to tech up and starting to power up, and where we can actually use that to our advantage by taking the numbers advantage. The Skink Cohorts are still going to be strong enough to compete at this level, but we can afford so many more of them. So you can see here, now I'm a little bit slow on the uptake, trying to get some of my Chameleon Stalkers into position here to attack the targets, especially if I can get them through, and their Javelins do some decent damage on the entry. Want to try to get them in there to at least push their missile units back. We just set up some safe zones for our Salamanders to start firing at things without too much obstruction, and just see how the battle progresses. We've also got our Chameleon Skinks moving in. I mean, obviously I'm going to put them attacking on this flank, because that's where I placed them before the battle, but it's a really good opportunity to hit the back of some of these units again. So you can see, right, we're definitely getting some friendly fire in here from these Salamander hunting packs, so I try to rearrange this to a slightly better high ground position. Really should move this one as well. But we're doing a lot of damage to them. We're pushing them back really quickly. And again, this is kind of what I talked about for the sweeping condition, right? Now that we're starting to win on this side of the battlefield, it means I can take better positions moving in around the flanks here. It's going to free up some of these Skink Cohort units, and it's also going to allow my Chameleon Skinks to traverse across the back. We just kind of got to get things in position. If you saw that volley on their Lord there, that did some pretty good damage to him too. You gotta kind of hope for no friendly fire in a one-on-one combat, but you can see they're already pulling back, and we're able to mostly maintain this formation where we have them more or less surrounded, right? Take some really horrible damage on the Skink Cohorts there, but it doesn't matter too much. We've got the Salamanders in place, lined up on that fighting line. Like, the fact is we just have this nice surround on them, and so they don't really have anywhere to run. But you can see, even though we're taking a decent amount of damage, we're really starting to deal enough damage and push a lot of these forces back. We kind of lose our surround here as they break through, but we still have plenty of power here, and we're able to just push back against them. And that's pretty much the end of this one. You know, there's still a decent number of their forces, but you can see the battle's definitely... balance of power, well, even the balance of power is really starting to lean into our favor at this time. And again, looking at the post game, I mean, you can see we definitely watched that warp fire thrower blast hit that Skink Cohort along with a bunch of other missiles. So they took a lot of damage, but you can see, you know, we still got a good flank off with the Chameleon Skinks. We got a lot of value out of these Salamander hunting packs, and these Chameleon Stalkers just, they did some okay value, but we're probably going to want to trade those out for something different. So going back to this custom battle screen, we should drop some of these. We should drop some of those Chameleon Stalkers. We can throw in maybe a couple more Skink Cohort, and that'll actually give us the room to recruit some other monsters as well, so we can get something like maybe some Lizardon in there. And now we have a full 20 stack, right? And this is still less expensive than that Skaven army. So even though we definitely took some damage in that earlier fight, again, the fact that Chameleon Stalkers are more expensive then Skink Cohort with javelins. Like I think that's the bottom line right there. These definitely got some more damage value. The biggest damage value is just these 2 little javelins that they throw when they're approaching combat. These can be a really good flanking unit. Maybe for fun we would put 2 chameleon skinks on one flank and 2 chameleon stalkers on the other flank. But in general, I think this is the kind of ratio you want. I don't know, my buddy really likes the salamander hunting pack. I think the Lizardmen hunting pack are good too. Really, whichever way you go, I don't think you're going to have too many problems. And again, you can see how well it works just because they do the damage, and the Skink Cohort are just cheap and so easy to replace. Now, the last composition I want to talk about, again, I said I would bring this up. It's more of an honorable mention. I think this would work great, but I just don't think I need to demonstrate it because we already saw a demonstration pretty much of how this will work. It's just using Skinks now instead of Saurus. But yeah, Terradon Riders. Terradon Riders with Fire Leech Bows, really strong unit. And again, you can see the insane cost effectiveness. I can take a full stack of this. I could put more Terradon Riders in here if I wanted to, which I don't know if I'd really recommend that, but we could even upgrade these to the Fire Leech Bola variant and still have money left over, right? This would be equivalent cost for the Empire army, and this would just obliterate it. We'd annihilate that. We'd have just a great ratio of like a kill-death ratio for that fight. So anyway, just a friendly reminder, this is definitely a viable possibility. Skinks and then making that Terradon building and going into this composition. Now, that's a lot of compositions. We're not too far in yet. Hopefully you're bearing with me and enjoying it and learning a lot of things as we go. That is the end of all of our discussion and demonstration for early game compositions where you're getting up to tier 3 in your main and secondary settlement and put 1 military building in each. These are the kind of options that I think you can use, combinations of units that have good synergy that you can combine together for positive effects on the battlefield. With that being said, let's move into the mid-game where we talk about having your main settlement to tier 4 and adding in a 3rd military building to the combination possibilities. Alright, so we're back to the campaign map once again, and this time we are moving into the mid-game army compositions. Now, this stage of the game would be when your main settlement building has reached tier 4, and so even in a minor settlement like this, you would then unlock 2 build slots at once. Essentially, I'm going to say that this allows us to have 3 military buildings in addition to all the economic buildings that we want. Up until now, it would have been a struggle to work in heroes, but I definitely should have been recommending Skink Chiefs for replenishment, right? This is pretty easy to get. Even if you're doing like a Saurus-focused composition in the early game, you can still kind of build this building just to recruit the Skink Chief and then demolish it to switch over to Terradons or whatever you wanted to do, okay? But yeah, so in this stage, we should have more flexibility to kind of either create the shrine and get some heroes in, or if we're only using 2 buildings to make the compositions we're going to talk about, then we have that spare slot for a 3rd, whether that means we're going to go with the military building or additional economic boosting, or if we're going to go with some of the geomantic web stuff. That's kind of up to you. You have to make that decision for yourself. It's not what we're focusing on here, but anyway, yeah, so we're talking about tier 4 units, right? This means that we're going to do compositions that I'm going to center around beasts and Saurus units primarily, right? The first composition we'll be looking at is pretty much pure Stegadon. Stegadon Spam with heroes, right? It's a very popular Doom stack. There's some more details we'll share on it as we go. We're also going to be looking at beast units and hunting packs, okay? We're also going to be looking at beast units and flying units, okay? And we're going to take another look at like just a pure beast roster with like putting in a variety of them, trying to mix it up a little bit. Then as for like the Saurus and Temple Guard style, right, we're going to look at Saurus and flying units, and we're also going to look at Temple Guard plus Sacred Kroxigor and Temple Guard plus Horned Ones, because both of those are going to require the Weapons Crafters communes. So if we are going to go to the point where we get Temple Guard, we can at least try to get a little more value out of the Weapons Crafters commune by adding on one of the other unit types that it would require. So those are all the different options we're going to be looking at in the mid-game. Let's go back to the custom battle and take a look. Alright, so here we are on the custom battle screen. Time to look at some mid-game compositions. Right, like I said, I focus more on beast and like the Saurus type units, especially for the mid-game, because I just don't think that the Skinks are quite as relevant. So you're trying to pair something with either your Saurus infantry or your single entity monsters and try to work that out. Now, obviously, this isn't a full stack of Stegadons, but you can see as a point of the price, right, compared to this Skaven stack, right, you can get almost a full army here, and with this funding limit that I've set, which we're going to see used in different ways, you know, I can get one more Rattling gun in here, and we're still in that capacity. I can't even put a single additional Stegadon in here. So one thing to keep in mind with this composition, right, the Stegadon Doom Stack, many people are probably familiar with it, but a key component of it is having the red tree skills on your Lord to give them bonuses, as well as getting the research for them from your research tree, right? When we're just going into this custom battle and kind of, you know, facing off, and I know that's how Doom Stacks work, but I'm just trying to remind people, when we're doing this in custom battle, all else equal, right, we can kind of see that it's not necessarily as effective as some people are able to make it look. But that being said, it really is still possible to use this. And frankly, as the Lizardmen, precisely because your units are so expensive, you really do want to get like a solid stack of units. You don't really want a variety of, you know, different stacks of different units trying to cover different parts of the map. You need to centralize your power into single armies as much as you can, and just understand that you're going to have to accept that it's going to be a costly army, right? But that means that it's going to be powerful. So, I mean, we can see we barely have, like, we almost have half a size army. We're going to take on a full-size army of Skaven. I've made a pretty balanced roster here. This is a lot of different tier 4 stuff, and we've got some really strong counters, right? These Rattling guns are pretty all-purpose, armor piercing, and they're going to slow us down. They've got Warplock Jezzails, Warp Lightning Cannons, and even some Storm Vermin with Halberds. So they've got a lot of answers to our actual composition. They've got a lot of things that should kind of counter us and do a lot of damage here. We've got the Life Priest, like the Life Slan, and I took the Skink Oracle, again, for the healing, because we're going to need it. I have a Skink Chief on a Stegadon here. People criticize the Skink Chief performance a lot, and honestly, I think it's just because the AI tends to focus on them so much, and we'll see that play out in the battle as well. But basically, in order to use a composition like this effectively, it's not necessarily about, you know, unit counters, right? Because we're not building this to counter their army. So what's important is target prioritization, right? Effective target selection and prioritization. The ability to choose the right targets and position yourself well in the battle in order to make sure that you kind of maintain some level of a strength advantage at all times. Taking a quick glance at this as well, this is only going to take one military building, so that means we're going to be able to easily manage to get other heroes. You may need to choose between Scar Veteran and Skink Priest, and assuming that you have a Life Slan, I might actually recommend the Scar Veteran. You could get the Mage building up and then recruit one, then swap it, yada yada. I'm kind of overanalyzing here, but whatever your preference with heroes is, you should be able to figure it out, right? But so like I said, let's jump into the replay and take a look. So yeah, the reason this composition works is basically because of the healing combined with the general usage of the Stegadon, right? And again, even the abilities of your Slan and their healing powers are going to be affected by your campaign skills and your research as well. But essentially, this functions as a long-range artillery piece. Doesn't do devastating damage to a lot of targets, but it's just effective against both infantry and single entities, and it's a capable melee combatant, right? Its main weakness is against single entity units as well as powerful anti-large infantry, but you can compensate for this by target firing them down. So that's what we see here, right? We start out of range from everything except their Warp Lightning Cannons, and we start targeting them down. And if we're lucky, we just end up destroying them. Technically, we're in range of their Plague Claw catapults, but, right, I mean, that hurt actually a decent bit. We took some damage there, but frankly, we don't care too much about the Plague Claw catapults. Maybe I should prioritize them a little more, but personally, I just don't. This is like an anti-infantry tool, right? It's not necessarily an anti-large tool. It's not going to hurt us as bad as these Warp Lightning Cannons. You know, of course, I say that, and the Warp Lightning Cannons are mostly misfiring while the Plague Claws are doing the damage. But yeah, so we've got, right, Earthblood and then Regrowth as well. So in this case, because the Skink Chief is taking so much damage, I'm going to use Regrowth on that instead. But whenever you get the opportunity, you want to try to pop some healing spells on your different troops. Yeah, maybe the Plague Claw catapults are worth more than we think. So we'll speed things up here. Right, we managed to kind of break down the Warp Lightning Cannons. That causes them to move forward. Some of the next targets we want to focus on are the Warplock Jezzails and the Rattling Guns. Right, the Warplock Jezzails have kind of a deceptively low damage level, but they shoot from a long range. They have very high armor piercing damage, and of course they damage your armor as well. So we do kind of want to focus those down as much as we can. The enemy continues to approach us, right? We throw down that shield that the Life Slan has here. I don't think that you'll actually get that in campaign. Yeah, we use that shield ability here in multiplayer. You may or may not have that in the campaign, depending on where you're at. But once they start getting close, we kind of want to send some units out to intercept them, right? To prevent them from totally disrupting our lines. And this will give us some good opportunities here as well, right? We'll be able to pop some healing down, maybe pop some defensive spells down. We got the Banishment, because that's a bound spell that comes with this character in multiplayer. We've got Dwellers Below popped over here. And so that's the kind of stuff that you do, right? You still want to make use of your magic abilities on some of these grouped up units, and you're probably going to need to in order to give yourself the advantage. Now, we see those units retreat a little bit here, and we don't want to chase too thoroughly, but if you feel that you've broken through their front lines enough or your ammo count is running low enough, this is a good time to push through and try to target down some of their ranged units, right? You can see I get over here and disrupt these Rattling guns, and now they're doing no damage. That's kind of critical, right? One of the biggest weaknesses we have when facing against this kind of composition is that, you know, they have the advantage if they stay at range the whole time. We need to do a good job of defeating their infantry and then being able to push back against them. So you see it gets a little chaotic here, but this is pretty much where it's wrapped up, right? We were able to target fire down some of their Storm Vermin with halberds on the approach, do some damage to their Warplock Jezzails, and once we got a couple of good spells in, we break through their front lines and we're able to push through to their missile units with our melee units and basically win the fight. So yeah, like I said, the AI really wanted to target down the Skink Chief, but as long as you can kind of, you know, it gives you a good opportunity to cast Regrowth on it and get some good healing value out of that. You can get a little bit better value out of Earthblood, but anyway, you can see we honestly don't take too bad of damage. We get them to rout, and if we were to come back into it, we'd have the advantage because some of their more dangerous units are already so heavily damaged. So that's the Stegadon stack. Again, you can see I don't have a full stack, and I've given them a full, powerful stack. Should be a real problem for us, but we still perform fine. Like I said, target fire and prioritization is key here. But in the campaign, you're going to want to have a full army of these ideally. And so that means that you're going to be able to take on a lot of different, very serious forces and probably receive even less damage. Now, the next composition I want to look at is another composition where we use beast units and then we combine them with hunting packs. Now, the theory is similar to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. It's actually similar to using your skink units and combining them with beasts, right? We've got some beast units to pin the enemy in, right? The Stegadons have the artillery and can draw them in, but this is a competent melee fighter and can get into infantry melee. And same thing with the Ark of Sotek Bastiladon. I don't know, it's tough to justify using Bastiladons of any type in this stage of the game. Its stats just aren't that great, but its performance is okay. I mean, would you rather have 3 Bastiladons or 2 Stegadons? Probably 2 Stegadons, but I wanted to put some variety in here. But yeah, so we're using those 2 buildings. We still have room to get some heroes in here without too much effort, right? You probably could even carry over the Skink Chief from earlier if you went Skinks Beasts into Hunting Packs Beasts. But the biggest problem with this composition is these are both kind of expensive units, right? You have very expensive beasts and moderately expensive hunting packs, so it's hard to get together a full-size army. You can even see the balance of power does not like this. Now, in this case, I actually want to do the demonstration against Tomb Kings because another key feature of this kind of composition is it's probably going to be more defensive, right? I'm talking about using these units to pin enemies in place so that your hunting packs can shoot at them. Well, if it's a Skaven army with a bunch of artillery and missile units, the AI is never going to approach you in the first place, right? So this is better when we're dealing with Tomb Kings or perhaps Greenskins. This might be the kind of composition you'd want to use. Again, it's very expensive, however, so you need to make sure that you have the ability to afford this army. And honestly, its performance isn't that great. It took some testing, and I tried to play around with things, right? The idea is there. Armor-piercing Razordons, anti-large Salamanders, anti-infantry Stegadons and Bastiladons, and some damage from the ranged units. But it's just not enough, especially going up against like a decent mob of Tomb King's infantry, plus all their constructs. Again, in theory, these are some of the right counters. But anyway, let's get into the battle and see how it plays out. Maybe a couple other things I could mention about this composition. You know, one of the things to keep in mind with the Lizardmen at this stage of the game is you should be flexible with the kinds of units you put in this composition, right? Going up against the Tomb Kings, I'm going to want a few more Salamanders because we're just going to have the anti-large bonus, right? The armor piercing from the Razordons will be nice, but we don't necessarily need that against their infantry, right? It would be nice against their constructs, but having the anti-large missiles to deal with their constructs instead is probably going to be more valuable to us, right? That's also why we might want to pair with a fire mage so that whenever they cast, they get that fire weakness bonus, right? But so we start by focusing on the Ushabti Great Bow, try to shoot them down and weaken them, because those are some decent long-range armor-piercing missiles that the enemy has. And basically we just let them approach, and then we kind of try to engage them in melee, position our hunting packs in order to get maximum damage value on the enemies. But you can see, again, the problem is this army's too expensive. We don't have enough tar pit units. Maybe I should bring more Ark of Sotek Bastillodons to hold the line, or even just put some Skink Cohorts in here to balance things out, but we just end up not having enough units to effectively hold the lines, right? It's going okay. We're getting some good shots in here, right? We're able to kind of target down, and this is where the salamanders really are key, is they have so many different constructs. Being able to take out some of these tomb scorpions and give yourself the advantage while we're getting hit by the archers is crucial. Even being able to get some armor-piercing shots on their lord is actually really nice from our Lizardons. You know, this is, and especially since we're facing Tomb Kings, if we can take out their lord, that's going to give us a big advantage as well. Now, I've got a Beast Mage here. We can get some debuffs on the enemy. We can get some buffs on our own units. We've got some kind of variety of magic, but I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to go Heaven's Mage instead. Just try to keep it slightly varied. But yeah, so you can see, here's a great example. So this Ushabti's breaking through. It's already in like a 2 versus 1 against our Stegadon, and our Stegadon here routes. So like I said, this composition's just a little bit too expensive, and you just don't have the stopping power and the holding power. I think that in campaign, it can still be functional, because in a campaign, you're going to be a little bit more likely to have the funds, and you're going to bring a full 20 stack to a fight, so you're going to be able to win these. But you can see once we start seeing these break through, this is where we're kind of in trouble, right? Now we've got our hunting packs engaged in melee, which isn't really what we want, right? We get some good hits from these salamanders, but now they're engaged in melee. This Ushabti thankfully is about to die, and somehow this mob has all clumped up on these units, which really is a lifesaver, but it's a tenuous grip at best, right? We have a hard time here, kind of get surrounded, but that's pretty much it. You know, things start to get disorganized, and we kind of struggle to pull it through, but the advantage you still have is mobility here with these hunting packs, so trying to get them out of the way, trying to make sure that your Stegadons are either shooting at something or hopefully melee fighting something, and trying to get some good spell volleys off. If you can get, you know, that protective aura, you can get the bombardment spell for fire, especially on some of these bigger clumps, it can be pretty good. And even getting some salamanders around to flank and get some shots on the Ushabti, right? But generally speaking, right, the problem is you don't have a great answer to their infantry in this situation. The armor-piercing Razordon missiles aren't quite what you need, and the Stegadons are going to do okay, but your Stegadons have too many different targets at the start of the fight to necessarily be focusing on something like Tomb Guard with Halberd. But you can see we still pull out the win. Again, I think the composition makes sense. It's just the cost that's prohibitive. So if you can afford this, or depending on what your faction's specialty is, you might be able to get a better handle on it. But yeah, we take a lot of damage. We win this fight, and since they're undead, we wipe them completely, but we take a lot of damage here. So that is the Beasts and Hunting Packs combination. Again, this is one that would only take, you know, 2 buildings. We can use the Ark of Sotek because we're using the Beasts in here, but it's a tough one to recommend. Again, I can see it having some value when we're going up against like Tomb Kings or Greenskins, but I do think that there are going to be some better options available. Alright, so for this next composition, we're back to fighting the Skaven again. This time, we're going to combine Beasts with Flying units. Now, I know I was just talking about how the hunting packs can be somewhat less effective because they're expensive, and then I go and put some expensive flying units in here, but especially in campaigns, something like Terradon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas are very cost effective, but the reality is, in this fight, that's not actually what we need, and what we need is some Ripperdactyl Riders, right? When we're going up against the Skaven with this heavy missile and artillery forces, you know, we still want to be cautious about some of their infantry with our things like Ripperdactyl Riders, because our units are going to be pretty flimsy here, right? But this is only going to require those 2 buildings. It's going to free up some room for a bunch of heroes, and really we're just kind of using some of their stronger points to overcome the Skaven and overwhelm them, right? Basically, it works similar to the previous one. We try to use the Beast for holding the line and drawing the enemy in, and Flying units for doing damage to those masses. But the key component here is we have Ripperdactyl Riders as an additional advantage, where we have Flying Cavalry, as it's called, to go over their front lines and heavily disrupt their missile units, right? We also have the Quaddle for getting some damage spells for free. But so yeah, it's really got some good options here. Let's just get into the battle and see how it plays out. So again, we do have some more expensive units. We kind of have a slightly smaller army. I think using some Skink Cohort to fill this out might be okay. Of course, those are going to get obliterated by the Plague Claw catapults, unfortunately. But in this situation, so we kind of start out somewhat similar to the pure Stegadon fight, right? We're kind of taking a defensive position here. But really, we're just trying to get some initial early attacks done. You gotta be really careful about poking and prodding too much, but really we're just trying to goad them into breaking formation here, right? And as soon as they do that, that's when we can move in. We don't want to attack their missile units while their infantry is still around to protect it, right? Instead, we kind of want to bait them out a little bit. But you can see I'm already moving in here, right? We're kind of forcing them to make a decision of, are they going to let the Stegadons stay at a distance and shoot them forever? Or are they going to move forward and try to contest us and allow us to get on top of their back lines? And, you know, really I make this move before we even get too far, just because you don't want to let your units get shot at too much. But at this point, we've disrupted a large number of their units, right? They had 4 Rattling Guns, 2 Warp Lock Jezzails. Well, half of those are disrupted now. Warp Lightning Cannons, done. Another Warp Lightning Cannon, in big trouble. 2 Warp Lock Jezzails, both of them, huge trouble, right? So we've got these Rattling Guns, but now we've got all this time for these Stegadons to be shooting at their lords, shooting at these Storm Vermin with halberds and getting some damage, and we haven't even really used our spells much, or used our Terradon Fire Leech Bowls, right? So we've got pure disruption on their back lines, breaking a lot of their artillery, baiting some of their units into defending their artillery, so that we can then move back out and take out some of these ranged units that are in the midline. We end up, again, you can see we get enough free damage on them because their army's so split up that they aren't really able to successfully attack our front lines here. And the Stegadons just get a lot of free damage, fly over them once, drop some bombs on them with the Terradon Fire Leech Bowls. Like, it's easy to... The Terradon Rider with Fire Leech Bowl, they're very strong in the early game stages, but once we get to this stage and enemies start getting more armor, they honestly don't quite hold their weight. They're still an effective unit, but you can see right at this point, we don't have the infantry to pair with them. So what we're doing instead is we're using them as kind of a supporting unit, but we want to be more aggressive, right? We're trying to find new ways to take aggressive postures with the Lizardmen. Stegadon sitting at home isn't exactly aggressive, but being able to combine that with the Ripperdactyl Riders, right? We're kind of taking a different approach here, and so instead of trying to bomb their lines and break through them, we're trying to split them up and force them to just be completely scattered to the wind. So yeah, it just kind of continues here. Get a little bit careless, but yeah, Assassin gets one hit on my Lord and then gets sniped down. Right, and that's pretty much the end of the game. So yeah, we can see the Saurus Warrior took a little bit of damage. You know, it's nice to have the Scar Veteran, right? It's nice to have that, actually, for helping defend your backline of Stegadons. This is a unit that I can put in with those Storm Vermin with halberds, and especially if it's well leveled up in the campaign, it's going to do a lot of damage. We had one Ripperdactyl Rider take some damage, and one of the Stegadons get hurt a little bit, but again, this battle, the performance in this battle, right, at least our outcome, is a lot better than what we did with any of the other compositions we put up against the Skaven. I suppose it's only been the Stegadon so far, but you can just see, right, the campaign bonuses will still play a large role here. But anyway, this is a very effective campaign for disrupting missile and artillery heavy factions. Now, the last composition I want to talk about here, I've just labeled Beast Variety, right? We have so many different beast options. As we saw in the combination of beasts and hunting packs, we have a good variety of multi-purpose units available. And again, I want to stress how important it is to consider rotating out, you know, picking different blends and different ratios of units for different situations, right? If we're going up against a more ranged heavy faction, we need more Ripperdactyl Riders than Terradon Fire Leech Bolas. But a melee infantry heavy faction, we need more Fire Leech Bolas, right? Same kind of thing with the Bastiladons. Against like a ranged heavy faction, we probably want more Bastiladon Solar Engine for the blinding debuff than we necessarily want you know, something like a Bastiladon Ark of Sotek. But anyway, just to point out the variety of different monsters we have here, right? We've got a melee Bastiladon with a special AoE ability, the Vortex, that does some damage. We can bring Bastiladons with Revivification Crystals to use as backline support. They can still get in melee, but that's additional healing on top of our Life Slant and potentially a Skink Oracle. We've got a Bastiladon with Solar Engine for different types of damage. Still have the bonus versus infantry and armor-piercing weapon strength, but for that blinding attack, so this can kind of help with anti-missile units. And then, of course, we still bring Stegadons in here, so really just, it's more of a theory craft than anything. The point is just to keep in mind that you have these variety of options that you're going to want to use differently in different matchups. I think I could see this composition performing okay, but of course, being that it's all beasts, it's going to be expensive. Again, the main upside is, you know, with the exception of the Ark of Sotek, this allows you to invest in a bunch of different types of buildings without having to meet any other requirements except for the one for the Ark of Sotek Bastiladons. Our next set of compositions are going to be the ones that center around either Saurus or Temple Guard, right, using our melee infantry and seeing what we can pair with that. Right, at the start of the game, they do kind of start to get outclassed by beasts as a primary option, and it becomes more true into the late game, I believe. But depending on who you're going up against, you can still get a lot of effectiveness out of some of these compositions, right? So we take Saurus Warriors and sneak in some Temple Guard where we can. We do need the Weapon Crafters Commune for this, but we don't need anything special for our flying units. I want to bring at least one Quaddle, but with that Vortex spell, you have to be a little bit more careful with all of your own infantry on the ground. It's still a pretty versatile and interesting unit. You could definitely pull it out if you don't think that you're going to use it, and we could get another Ripperdactyl and a Fire Leech Bola in here. But basically, this is going to work similar to that last battle against the Skaven we saw, except what we're going to do is use our infantry to try to push the advantage, right? We're going to be actively pressuring their front lines as well as actively disrupting their back lines. So let's take a look at how that plays out. So you can see we have a similar setup here, and we basically just full send, right? I kind of get a little overzealous with the Terradons and my caster, kind of pull them back, pull them forward. You don't want to let them get shot too much. And you can see this is the big threat here, is the artillery is going to do a lot of damage. But as I've seen in some of the other guides that I've made as well, you know, that's how artillery works, right? It gives you the advantage in the start of the fight. It allows you to do heavy damage with some good lucky shots in the opening stages of the game, but up against an infantry-focused army like this, or at least an offensive pressure-focused army like this, once the enemy gets on top of you, you're going to quickly lose that advantage of the artillery. Now you can see I used the Quaddle spell right off the bat. We didn't really get a great pathing on it, but a lot of damage to the Warp Block Jezzails, and you can also see that somehow those Rattling Gunners missed this Saurus Old Blood a ton, and that's really big for us. Now, we pull those Terradon Riders forward. Since we saw that their missile units were distracted, we can get a nice little bombing pattern off here and get a lot of damage on these Halberd units. That's kind of nice. We also get the Ripperdactyl Riders in position, maybe a little early, because you know you want them to be there and they can help disrupt the lines, but I don't want to send them in until my infantry hits, because I don't want them to get too caught up fighting some of these some of the enemy infantry, right? But so kind of keep some of these units out a little bit, try to get some spells cast, get some debuffs in there, give yourself the advantage. But again, here we've got our infantry lines starting to collapse on units now. We've got the Terradon Riders to put constant, you know, melee or missile pressure on everything. We send the Ripperdactyl Riders in to kind of collapse on their artillery, collapse on some of their missile units. You can see already here in the back line we're going to be able to chase off a lot of stuff. We've already put a lot of damage on. Big Comet of Cassandora. God, I love that spell so much. Oh, yeah. Good balance of using... This is going to be a micromanagement heavy army, but a nice balance of using some of your spells to soften up some of their strongest points when your melee hits the front lines, being able to target down consistently some of their ranged units and keep those under wraps. And then the biggest problem here is kind of hero hunting, but as much as you can keep either, you know, the Quaddle hitting some of those big units, or at least keep your Saurus Spears and Temple Guards on them, you should be in pretty good shape. We do have the Skink Chief on the Stegadon. They're not really going to be the key unit. But you can see this enemy army is already in shambles, right? We definitely took some heavy damage from the artillery on the way in. But once we hit those front lines, we're just able to deal damage so effectively and disrupt their most powerful units so easily that we gain a huge advantage. Yeah, and so we took a lot of damage on the one Saurus unit, but besides that, we actually come out of this battle in very good shape. And if we really wanted to, we have a ton of fast flying units. We can easily run down many of these units in that post-game battle. So that's our Saurus and flying units composition. Again, I think that this is going to struggle a little bit more once we get to that final stage of the game, right? Once we get to tier 5. If the Skaven start bringing some of their monstrous units here instead, we might have some trouble. But for now, this melee infantry remains as relevant as it ever was. And just by switching up what kinds of flying units you bring, you can still give yourself the advantage depending on who you're going up against. Now, the last composition I'm going to demonstrate is going to be Temple Guard plus Sacred Kroxigor going up against the Tomb Kings. Now, again, I've talked about this one before. I don't know if it's the best combination anymore. It definitely is stronger. Well, Sacred Kroxigor were with Nakai. I don't know. It's a composition that makes sense, right? It has synergy. You've got the more defensive-oriented Temple Guard, offensive-oriented Sacred Kroxigor. Because you have the Skink building built into this composition, it means we can bring some chameleon skinks or something like that for a little bit of flanking if we need to, right? This would be good for Vanguard deploying and then collapsing on the enemy's artillery, right? Now, we're not going to see that with this Tomb King's army, but the point is, this is still going to be a little bit more of a well, it can be defensive or offensive, right? I intend to use this composition defensively against the Tomb Kings in this battle to kind of show, how it plays out. And what the purpose of these units can be. But of course, I can walk my Temple Guard and Sacred Kroxigor forward, just like we did in that last battle. And yeah, since you're going to have like a tier 3 building to get these, you do need the Weapons Crafter commune to be able to get the Temple Guard. But being able to spam some of these out, and you'll have to try to find room to fit some heroes in. But by the time you have control of any other province with, at this point in the mid game, you should be able to find some room for heroes. And still be able to include the Weapon Crafters commune in the relevant province. But anyway, let's get into the battle and take a look at how this one plays out. So, like I said, in this battle, I intended to take a little bit more of a defensive posture. Of course, we have to move up because the Tomb Kings are not going to... They're the defenders in this particular battle. But it's not too hard for us to move up on them, right? Don't want to send your heroes out to get them shot at too early by the Ushabti with great bows. But basically... we've got lots of line holders, but they're still going to do okay in melee. Got some damage dealing units. The biggest problem here, and maybe this is the kind of army where instead of doing beasts and hunting packs, you would do something like Temple Guard and hunting packs. I might be discovering my own new composition here that I should have included, right? Here's the problem with the Sacred Kroxigor, okay? They don't have very good stats. They've got good melee attack, moderate melee defense, but their charge bonus just isn't that great compared to some of these other units that we're bringing, right? Like, this costs more than the Temple Guard. Why, looking at their stats, why wouldn't I just bring more Temple Guard, right? It's maybe for the magic damage and a little bit of the charge bonus, the ability to, slightly increased, decently increased maneuverability, right? But they lose their anti-infantry bonus that regular Kroxigor have. We're also at a point where the armor piercing will be more valuable, but we can also get armor piercing like that on some of the hunting packs as well. So I know I'm showcasing this composition and I'm talking it down, but it's tough. I understand why people might not like this idea and would probably make a case against Sacred Kroxigor. But you can see we still got, a couple of Skink Cohort. You can see how valuable those can be. All of this damage put onto them instead of something useful. Now, I make a really idiotic mistake and I just move everything forward too far, which puts my chameleon skinks into battle. But the idea with bringing these is they're still going to get some chip damage and the poison debuff on some of these large units, right? So once we pull them back a little bit, we can kind of get some damage done. But of course, up against an army like this, right, Tomb Kings or Greenskins, well... So what if they bring a Tomb Scorpion? That's not going to do great against my Temple Guard. Their Tomb Guard probably going to do okay, right? But we have other tools for that, right? We have the magic that we can use, and that's where our Sacred Kroxigor come in, right? The Sacred Kroxigor are here to team up and try to help. Oh, I don't know how this happened. Anyway. Yeah, the Sacred Kroxigor are meant to help, team up on stuff, right? I really if I had a spare unit, I'd send it over to attack that Tomb Guard. And then you can see, yeah, we try to get a Burning Head, try to spend some spells to disrupt some of their archers, right, some of their ranged units. Since we have infantry on the front lines, it's a little bit riskier to use those spells. But you can see it kind of pans out a little boring. I'm barely even cycle charging the Saurus Kroxigor, but we're doing good damage just in virtue of the Temple Guard being a decent enough holding unit, especially when going up against all these types of enemies. And that's pretty much it. I feel like there's not too much more to talk about on this one. We just kind of let the battle play out and slowly but surely kind of overwhelm them, do some cycle charging where we can. And when we're getting these units down, we're kind of fully eliminating them. So it's really about picking them off one by one and reducing their numbers to a point where it's now manageable for your army. And even though your units are weakened, you can still kind of team up on them and overwhelm them. And yeah, again, just continue to take them down piece by piece, and eventually we should win. So you can see we definitely take some damage on this one as well. I know people don't really like Temple Guard that much, and somehow the Saurus Kroxigor actually took the least amount of damage here. But again, it's the Tomb Kings. We get a full wipe on them. So I think that these are the kinds of armies that Lizardmen struggle to deal with. Honestly, I think it's because this is almost a mirror matchup, right? The Lizardmen are supposed to be like infantry and single entity monster focused. They're supposed to be more the offensive play style. And so going up against an enemy with that same play style is going to mean more losses. Again, with campaign bonuses, right, a big part of this composition is Temple Guard and Saurus Kroxigor share the exact same skill point. So being able to take advantage of that is going to make them a little bit stronger. Getting the research for them is going to help with this. But it's just, again, just another idea. I think it's a somewhat effective composition. And really it depends on who you're going up against, right? Like, let's go to the last composition, and then I'm going to wax poetic for a little bit. Now, our last composition is Temple Guard plus Horned Ones. Again, trying to make use of that Weapons Crafter's commune for more than just a single unit that we're putting into our army. And this is going to kind of work very similar to the flying combination that we saw, and it's going to work great against units like Skaven. However, Cavalry does take a lot of micromanagement. These Horned Ones do have great stats, and I think some people are going to advocate for the success of a composition like this. Again, the biggest problem is just you're going to have the weakness of sieges, right? These units are basically going to be worthless in a siege, and so that's the biggest problem that it has, especially with, you know, there's not that many sieges in this game, but there's going to be enough, and especially if the enemy AI builds walls. But regardless, right, this is going to devastate this Skaven army in a field battle. It's going to look very similar to what we did with the flying units. We're going to kind of get around on the flank. Once our infantry units hit the front line, we collapse with our cavalry, and we get them surrounded. So yeah, just another alternative. Now, like I said, something to keep in mind. Let's go back and look at another composition here. So I've talked about this a lot, but I want to make this clear that you really do need to consider, like, you have to figure out for yourself the ratio and the blend of different units that you're using, depending on which kind of enemy you're matching up against, right? Going up against these Skaven, if I'm using this sort of like beasts and hunting packs composition, I probably don't need as many salamanders because we're not really facing off against their large units, right? I want more Lizardons in this kind of army, and I probably want either revivification crystals or just more Stegadons or Bastiladons. And we saw how effective the Stegadon spam was against this composition. Probably more so than the beasts and hunting packs. But something else to keep in mind, right? If we're doing hunting packs, we have the Ancient Salamander. I didn't really put this in here because I personally don't use this unit much, and I don't get a lot of value out of it. But it's almost like an upgraded Solar Engine Bastiladon, right? One of the key points is it's going to create weakness to fire damage. So by combining an Ancient Salamander or two with some Salamander hunting packs, we can actually find a lot of value in that way as well, right? So being able to combine different aspects, or if we're facing off maybe against, we have the Solar Engine Bastiladons for their missile units. We might use an Ancient Salamander if we're facing off against a more melee-heavy army instead, right? There's just a lot of different combinations between the different types of units and some of their synergies, so it's just something to keep in mind. I mean, we even saw the flying units. We want to shift more into Ripperdactyl Riders when we're going up against a missile-focused army, but we probably want to keep a few more Terradon Riders with Fire Leech Bolas if we're going up against kind of an infantry-heavy army. But then again, when we get into the late game against Tomb Kings and Greenskins, we are going to see more of those single entity monsters. It's where the Fire Leech Bullets are going to lose their effectiveness. But at this point, we're starting to ramble a little bit. But hopefully you get the point, right? There's a lot of different units in here. Kind of try to consider the different compositions I've used and how they synergize, and then consider what units you like, right? Try to find a place where you can put those units into a composition and then add in other units around them that will work well together. That's one of the keys for being successful with Lizardmen army compositions. Now, that covers everything that I want to for the mid-game. I've shown some stronger compositions, I've shown some weaker compositions, we've tested some things out, we've learned some lessons along the way. Let's move on to the late-game army compositions. So, of course, we're back to the campaign map just one more time. And when we're talking about late game, we really are talking about this stage of the game, right? Your main settlement is at tier 5. You probably have more than one province at tier 5 or building towards tier 5. It basically means that you should have access to any combination of buildings, right? Anything that requires the Weapons Crafters Commune, you can make a spot for it. You have multiple provinces that you can recruit the same tier 5 units from. You have multiple provinces where you can get hero capacity increase buildings from. So I don't want to say no holds barred. You know, I'm not going to be showing you a 19 Saurus Scar Veteran spam stack. But we just want to consider, right, we're going to have the addition of the possibility of Dread Saurians, as well as Ancient Stegadons, Feral Carnosaur, Feral Troglodon. We also are going to have the Ancient Stegadon Engine of the Gods, because of course we do need the Ziggurat of the Old Ones in order to unlock that. So the compositions we're going to be building from basically have unlimited range in terms of units and unit variety. So let's go back to the custom battle and take a look at some of those. The first composition that we're going to look at here is the Stegadon Spam. Of course, now that we're in the late game, we can afford, more of these units. We're going to be able to upgrade some of our heroes with some better mounts and abilities, afford more expensive heroes in general. I did increase my funding limit a little bit here. You can see this is still not enough to get a full army of Stegadons, despite the fact that this is a full army of greenskins and we still have some leftover money, so we kind of threw together just a little bit of extra chaff here for us to go up against. But yeah, basically, we're going to see how the Stegadon stack performs against these greenskin units. I put the greenskins in here in the late game because, frankly, as the Lizardmen, that is probably what you're going to go up against, right? Even if you've taken over Lustria, you're going to move across the deserts to fight the Tomb Kings, and most likely find the greenskins there as well. If you start in the southeast, you're going to have to go up against the greenskins even sooner. So we're going to kind of see how some of those interactions can play out. But yeah, I've done greenskins and Skaven armies for the tier 5 just because I think those are your typical opponents, and it shows both like an offensive style enemy, right? Infantry and cavalry heavy giants versus the more defensive style with a lot of artillery and missile units from the Skaven. So we got a couple different things to look at here. Let's get in here and let's take a look at the replay. So, as per usual, part of it is just going to kind of be making sure we target fire the right things. Before I could set firing priorities, they all shot at the giant. But honestly, that's not a bad option, just because you can see its health is getting low. We could eliminate this from the game really early on. Now, when you're using these Stegadons, I think a couple of your priority targets are the Black Orcs for sure, right? These are just going to do a lot of damage to you. You're going to trade okay with them, but your best bet is to do a lot of damage to them with, like, yeah, look at that shot, look at that shot. You can see you can do a lot of damage to them before they hit your lines, and that's pretty crucial. The Ragnarok spiders, of course, are going to be very dangerous as well because they do have anti-large. So you don't have a ton of great options here. I've also kind of fired some at the cavalry units. But yeah, you can see things just kind of hit the fan, right? Their archers get in range. We want to drop some magic spells on them. We want to try to get some of our heroes engaged with their more valuable units. It's really tough, especially with some of your heroes, right? Since we have all these Stegadons, it's hard to get your heroes into the right places and into safe locations. But it seems to be, I mean, we're going to take a few losses, but you can see, right, they can pop spells like this, and that's one of the benefits of this kind of army is, especially those vortex spells, wind spells, you can basically shrug off any of the magic from the enemy. The most important thing for them is going to be buffs and debuffs. But so, they get near, we want to send a couple of Stegadons out if we can. Don't forget they have kind of an insane charge bonus. So really making sure that you get that charge bonus, getting a good start to the fight. But here's where, yeah, part of what you're doing here is using your magic as offense and defense. You want to be throwing down heals whenever you can. You want to be throwing down big offensive spells to land damage and get clears. And yeah, just trying your best to focus down priority targets whenever you can. I got their boss on the Wyvern mount, so you can see that's flying around. Should have some good opportunities, like even one little shot from, 1 or 2 shots from your Oracle on the Troglodon can do some serious damage. We get their leader to route, that's going to give us an advantage, especially if we can kill him or shatter him. Anything we can really get some good snipe kills on while they're retreating. But yeah, you can see the damage is kind of spread all around. And it can be hard to make sense of what's going on in a battle like this, trying to find where's the spider, how do I get my units to focus fire it. But really just, again, effective target prioritization. See their war boss coming back in. We'll see if we can maybe get a snipe on it. He's going to run away. Oh, we get that one or two more shots would put an end to it. But yeah, especially once we kind of get bogged down here, that's where you really do want to, like some of these Stegadons that route and retreat, right? Once we end up getting these like retreated back lines, see, we take kind of a mass route there, but in a way it just puts us in position to start using our missile attacks again, right? We've still got a couple of units that are in the fray. We can drop heals on them and focus supporting them, and that allows us to take advantage of all these different missile units that we have, like the missile usage of these, right? Get rid of those black orcs, focus down one of these Arachnarok spiders, maybe even get some shots on that rogue idol. I prowl one of these, and man, these things are just so tanky. They're pretty scary to deal with. But yeah, you can see it becomes a chaotic mess. You want to try to keep some of your units in melee, some of your units fighting from range, and especially whenever you can focus fire on some of their high priority targets, that's really going to give you an edge. And you could see he tried to go into Rampage and he couldn't even do that. He got hurt too badly. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of this fight. So you can see we take a decent bit of damage. Again, research is going to help us in this situation. Getting more healing spells cast, right? And in general, just having, maybe some knowledgeable lords. Just various advantages that we can get from your actual campaign skills to make this go a little bit better in healing. But yeah, I mean, this is a pretty dangerous army to go up against as well, right? We have a lot of serious threats to the Stegadons, and yet we're still able to pull out a win. If you really wanted to, you could do the post-game cheese where you heal your units in the post-game as well and kind of make back some of this health, but for a fight like this, like, we really destroyed many of their high-value targets, and if they were to come back into another fight, these would still have all of their missile power, right? So we'd be able to pursue and take a pretty easy win here. Now, another late-game composition I want to show, this is kind of the variety pack, right? Again, we've got full roster heroes with some upgrades on them, some mounts and such. We've got a bunch of Temple Guard, Ripperdactyl Riders, Feral Carnosaur, and Stegadon. This is kind of the best of the best for each of your options, right? We've got a couple of flying units. We've got the Temple Guard for line holding. We've got the Carnosaurus for anti-large. We've got the Stegadon for all-purpose. And this army will be facing up against these greenskins again, right? And the idea here is, I in my last campaign as Kroxigor, I honestly had to sit down and try to figure out, like, how do you beat the greenskins? What are you supposed to do, right? I've talked before about mirror matchups. The Lizardmen are meant to be more of an aggressive, like, infantry and monstrous unit-based army where you want to be the aggressor. You're not trying to bait them in or use a defensive position with your artillery, right? So, but that's what the greenskins do, right? And so what wins there? Well, the Temple Guard, they're going to help counter some of their large units, right? This is what you use for the cavalry. This is what you use for the Arachnarok spider. It's hard to say that Temple Guard are going to counter a rogue idol, but technically they have the anti-large, right? These kind of counter each other, but for the rogue idol to cost twice as much as a Temple Guard, we'll see pretty good performance. Like, that's a pretty cost-effective trade. Then we have the Feral Carnosaurs for taking out those same units. As for the Black Orcs, your Temple Guard can at least hold the line, and that's really where you want your Stegadons to focus fire on them. In addition, that's where you want to try to get some spells off, especially in the early game as you can. But let's jump into the replay and see how this one plays out. So with this fight, I kind of want to set a semi-defensive formation with my Temple Guards, right? I want to give my Stegadons as much time to shoot at some of these priority targets as I can, get rid of some of the nuisances, right? Orc Boar Chariots. I don't know that the big uns really, the cavalry really needs to be shot down. But even getting shots on like the Rogue Idol, Ragnarok Spider, and especially the Black Orcs. Again, I should be focus firing these more. We still get the, nice spell, and since I brought a Light Mage this time, we're actually going to see another one, right? Nothing like some nice early attacks on some clumped up infantry mobs. Don't really get as much value out of this spell, but it's still really nice to have. And yeah, this army, even though there's a lot of different pieces here, it's also a little bit more, brain dead, automated. Like, you're not really doing much with the Temple Guards. The Temple Guards are more there to create favorable positions, and see, now I can send my Carnosaur and Stegadons through to attack unobstructed, right? They're going to make it to their targets without really getting blocked by anything. We also have these Ripperdactyl Riders, so that if they do bring some archers, or if they leave their spellcasters in the back line, we can go and pick some of those off with as well. We still, of course, have magic, so we keep some Stegadons in the back line here. They can get some damage. You can see I didn't even have to pay attention to what their lord was doing or where he was. We're able to just get rid of him just in virtue of him attacking into some Temple Guard and some of the other forces. And so in this fight, you'll see I almost kind of give up the middle. I try to focus down some of these side units more and get some of the assists on the flanks, right? Eliminate their cavalry advantage, eliminate their flank advantage, and although we're taking some damage here in the middle, we still have, the heal from the Skink Oracle. We have some buffs and debuffs from, our Light Mage and our Heaven's Priest, and so we give up the middle a little bit, like I said, and we're able to run distraction, have these Ripperdactyl Riders just kind of picking off targets, especially once something starts routing, right? I wouldn't send a Ripperdactyl in to fight an Ragnarok Spider one-on-one at the start of the fight, but when you've got it fleeing from the battle, that's a good opportunity for that, right? So Temple Guard definitely taking some damage, but that's what their purpose is, just to hold the line and help out, and we can keep a lot of our larger units at better health, being able to kind of select targets and get some real damage dealt. And let the Temple Guard slip off a little bit there, but yeah, you can see this is also another opportunity where we kind of get to focus down some enemies. And again, this one turns pretty chaotic, but we kind of have the answer to everything that they're going to bring, and so it's just using the right units at the right time, right? The Stegadons get used in the early game to target down things like the Black Orcs or do damage to the Ragnarok Spiders. Temple Guard kind of hold the line and create favorable positions, and then we can manually dictate the matchups, right? We can get the Stegadons onto the infantry mobs. We can get the Carnosaur to target down some of their large units. We can worry about where and when we're going to cast spells a little more easily, since we have a few less troops to really directly manage. Plus, we can disrupt their backlines pretty heavily, or just easily chase, run down their spellcasters. In general, it kind of has it all. I mean, that's the point of a balanced composition. And yeah, it takes a lot of different buildings, but especially when dealing with greenskins, I think it's tough, right? You don't necessarily have the answer to everything that they're going to bring. It can be challenging. It says a Pyrrhic victory, even though we really didn't take that. Like, compare the health. A lot of these units are pretty badly damaged, but compared to the health of all the Stegadons from the last time, I'd say we walked away from this battle in much better shape. Now I've got a couple more compositions to look at here. This is one of the last ones, and we are going to see a demonstration for this one as well. I've just labeled it Beasts Flying, right? We're going to make the most of some of our flying units. We're going to bring some beasts into the fray, and of course the Stegadons, and a full roster of heroes. But this time we're actually going to be going up against the Skaven, and so we still pretty much have their standard army, but with this increased funding limit, we can really bring some more of the fun tools, just, bringing in some extra heroes, and then some of their high-tech units to try and see, because this is honestly a solid Skaven army, right? This is going to be stuff that does a lot of damage, can carry you. I mean, this is like a really nice, well-balanced Skaven army that kind of has an answer to everything. So we're just going to tack some more danger on top of that, and we're going to see how this army performs. Now again, we're going to see a lot of the same concepts that we've seen here, right? We've got a whole host of Stegadons. You can see the game auto priority target fired those rattling guns. Honestly, that's not a bad idea. You can see just a single volley brings that unit down by a lot of health instead of trying to hope that we can destroy the warp lightning cannons. Still, of course, have the Plague Claw catapults dealing damage as well. But just being able to try to focus some of those down, you can see they still, again, decide to just almost only target our Skink Chief. But yeah, just one unit shooting those rattling guns once they've taken some initial damage can really take them out. Same game plan as before, right? Try to get some damage on their missile units as they come in. Try to focus down some of their infantry as they get a little bit closer. See if we can especially destroy some of these storm vermin with halberds. It's going to be nice. But you can see, so they're getting in range, starting to target down our Ripperdactyl Riders. We want to be careful to preserve our flying units here. But you can also see they've already heavily separated from their artillery here, and they're even starting to separate from their missile units. So this is when we kind of activate, we get them out on the flanks, right? They're going to start running in with some of their heroes and monstrous units, but of course we have a whole bunch of stuff on the front line for that, right? These Stegadons are just going to keep doing damage. We've got the Quaddles to try to drop some spells, and even here, right, it's okay to have some of these come in after us because we're going to have the decent frontline holders. Now we've taken some damage on these Terradons, but again, I've talked about that. That's how it goes with your missile units and your, well, with enemy artillery and your units, right? This Ripperdactyl's taking an absolute blasting right there, but you can see we're now disrupting not only their missile lines, but also their front lines, right? They pull back a bunch of units to try to protect these Rattling guns from this Ripperdactyl rider, but we've got another one on this Rattling gun unprotected. We're starting to hit their artillery, and their artillery is basically totally uncontested. We're definitely taking some damage on the front line. Here's where some of your buff and debuff spells can really help you hold the line, but again, just having pulled this clump of units, yeah, look at this. Having pulled that cluster of units out to try and get them, for them to try to target the Ripperdactyl riders and save the Rattling guns. We don't get an amazing vortex here, but honestly the start of it is... Oh, and it comes back. Oh, look at that. Oh, see you, bud. Nice. Right, so yeah, you can... Going after their back line helps divide their front line. Their front line already isn't going to do that great, and you just got to make sure that you're paying attention to it and not letting them get too much free damage on some of your more vulnerable units. But you can see this is where we start sending in the Quaddle to help assist in some of these melee battles where you might be in trouble. Get an easy free kill on their lord here. Our heroes are definitely taking a lot of damage, but we're still able to just keep getting in here and disrupting their artillery. You know, I didn't want to overcommit to the flying units and bring a ton of them to disrupt their artillery, because then you will... Like, this has been a really solid frontline hold. Our heroes have taken kind of ridiculous damage, but even if I had paid a little more attention and cast some more healing spells or just tried to keep them a little safer. But as for our actual, like, Stegadons and our, like, Quaddles, they're in great shape, right? Our monstrous units, our Carnosaurs, stuff like that, and that's... I mean, yeah, it's over, right? Like, you can see... If we can divide their front lines pretty easily, we can harass their back lines pretty easily, we can hold our own front line very effectively with this composition. So yeah, I just think that this, again, massive damage on our heroes, really kind of dangerous. If you really wanted to, you just group them up after the battle and you have the Oracle drop some heals on them. But again, relatively speaking, the health of everything else is really great. It's sad that I might have to hide my heroes at the start of the next fight, but, you know, again, just the quality of the health and the survivability of all the rest of these units versus, you know, the damage that they took, the outcomes here. Of course, some of these units did get away, and we don't necessarily have the best tools to chase. I mean, we've got the Carnosaurs and the Ripperdactyl riders. There's a lot of targets we would be trying to chase down here, but you can see, again, the outcome of this is pretty satisfactory. It's scary for those heroes, and we need to do a little bit more work to protect them. But again, we're not working with... By this stage of the campaign, these heroes are going to have much better stats and bonuses than they do going into this custom battle. So you got to keep that in mind as well. We're definitely not going to have this big of a problem in our campaign army. And if you eliminate that problem, what's left with the problem on this army? It's going to be in great shape. It's going to be very effective. Now, I have one last army that I want to look at here. I don't have a demonstration for this one, largely because this just isn't the kind of units that I use, and I don't have enough practice with them. I don't know really how I would super effectively use them in tandem with another, but I don't want to ignore the fact that Dread Saurians exist. I just don't... I don't know. I have a hard time justifying it, right? Depending on, I mean, especially if we're going up against something like Skaven, right? This is the kind of army that you would probably bring against the Greenskins instead of the Skaven, right? We've talked before about trying to get some frontline holders to tar pit the enemies so that your missile units can bog them down, right? So we've got Dread Saurians and Stegadons to hopefully tank things on the front lines, Bastiladon Solar Engine for that debuff from their attack for some help. Ancient Salamanders, again, might do okay in melee, but have that, like, fire damage debuff, Salamander Hunting Packs, and Razordons, plus all of our heroes, right? So we're going to rely on our heroes to hold a front line in a situation like this, as well as the Dread Saurian. We'll have the Stegadon to kind of fill the gaps where we need to, and then we've just got a bunch of missile units with, like, high cost effectiveness and pretty high damage, right? Pretty good damage values across all these units. It's going to take a lot of work to focus fire them down, and depending on who you're going up against, you might... Well, that's the tough part, right? If we take another look at this greenskin army, right, Black Orcs, another great option for dealing with those is the Lizardmen hunting pack. Personally, I think that's, technically speaking, in like a isolated one-on-one scenario, the Lizardmen hunting pack is the unit you want to fight the Black Orcs with. It's going to trade effectively. It's going to have enough between the charge bonus and getting like the occasional melee fight when they're damaged. Like a Lizardmen hunting pack will beat a Black Orc if managed correctly. But in general, right, the greenskins still have a bunch of large units, so don't you want to bring some salamanders? Well, but they have a bunch of armor on the Black Orcs. Don't you need the... It's hard to find the right balance of units to bring in an army like this, and you can see trying to balance it, like we just run out of spaces for everything. But anyway, this is the kind of unit that you could potentially use. Again, I didn't want to ignore the Dreadsaurian. It exists, and it's a tier 5 unit, and it's got great stats. Biggest problem is it's just low melee defense. It's an extra large size unit, so it can get surrounded very easily, and it's definitely not going to have the missile resistance that it needs to avoid getting obliterated, especially by something like Skaven. But so this is the last composition I wanted to show. Really, I like I said, I think Tier 5 doesn't change too many things. Basically, it's just allowing for the combination of some of these factors and really being able to kind of specialize depending on the enemy you're going up against, right? Whether you want to take more, like bring some more flying units for dealing with Skaven, or if you're going to bring more infantry for dealing with like the Greenskins or the Tomb Kings, being able to hold out against them better, right? Your Temple Guard are going to be an active counter to... They're going to have shields against missile units. They're going to have the anti-large bonus as well, and they're going to they're going to hold out well enough against infantry that the tools that you bring to actually deal with their infantry can make their mark, right? So those are the kind of ideas that you need to go into the late game with the Lizardmen. Honestly, a lot of the tier 4 compositions will work just fine as long as you like add in a couple of Carnosaurs or something like that, right? That's you don't need to make a ton of changes into the late game, and it really is going to focus even more on heroes, right? This is where you want to make sure your heroes have their mounts, that they're fully leveled up. Lizardmen heroes are very strong, and this is where they're going to come most into play, is in the late game. So that finally covers all the compositions that I wanted to for all the different stages of the game. I really hope you learned something. This is definitely a longer video, but I really like talking about these compositions, doing some theory crafting, and of course getting some demonstrations in so that people can get a better idea of how I would expect to see these armies used, what purpose they're for, what kind of opponents that they're going to be effective against, and in particular with the Lizardmen, trying to get the proper balance and blend of units. I know I talked about this at the start, trying to show, you know, not that you want an incomplete army of Stegadons, right? You want a full army, but if you can't afford a full army of Temple Guard and Kroxigor, how much of each do you bring? And really, again, one of the things to keep in mind as the Lizardmen is that ratio does change depending on who you're going up against, right? So you need to keep in mind whether we've got more armor or more like monstrous units, or if we have more missile units, you know, what am I going to try to lean into in order to make effective compositions to fight the enemy I'm going up against? Yeah, the Lizardmen, I think, you know, of course you can just do Skink Cohort spam into Stegadon spam, but if you don't want to go that route, I think that you have a lot more like malleable and modular armies that you want to recomposition in order to best fight the opponent you're specifically going up against at that time. But yeah, that's a lot of words, that's a lot of talking. We made it through it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I put a lot of work into this one, of course. If you did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe. Of course, I'm always open to feedback in the comment section below. There's always more things for me to learn. It's always helpful to have promote good discussion for people to refine their understanding of the ideas I've presented here. And of course, other people can provide their own feedback to give other people better ideas. And I'm always open for asking questions as well. I'm happy to write another 3-paragraph or 4-paragraph essay for every person who has questions about how to deal with this or that or the other thing. Or if you just want to call me an idiot, I probably won't respond to your comment, but I still love and respect you. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.